This has been going on for many, many years. Those of you, and it's rooted in this idea that all white policemen who aren't knowledgeable about the community and that are from the community are policing a group of people who are colonized, and I'll get into that theory. It's rooted in anti-black sentiment and ghettoization within the urban north. And not that there's not policing issues in southern cities, but the idea that you are, policing euphoria is part of ghettoization. And when I say ghettoization, you have to understand that ghettoization is a process of residential segregation, placing people in control, like within urban reservations, containing them, and then policing in that. I haven't been teaching this year, so I'm a little rusty. I'll have to relax a little bit here. Okay, so in the Albina district, this map shows you in Northeast Portland, as early as the 1930s, the Portland Realty Board had designated that area as the place to contain African Americans. And this is when the population was less than 2,000 people. World War II comes, you get a huge migration of about 20,000 black workers to come here, and they were also ghettoized within that area, okay? So that by 1960, 80% of black Portlanders, of 15,000 black Portlanders are in this area. And during the 50s, as blacks were moving in the post-war era, whites moved out, right? We've heard of white flight. Very interesting, always to me. I got interested in Albina because coming to Portland 16 years ago, and after studying urban poverty and ghettoization and concentration of poverty in Pittsburgh and Detroit, it was always fascinating me that even in a tiny city like Portland in the remote Northwest, you still have the phenomenon of ghettoization and all that goes with it, high unemployment, bad housing conditions, and that thing. So how and why does that occur has been a subject of study for many years. By 1970, Portland's segregation level was the second highest on the West Coast, behind only Los Angeles. For those of you that are familiar with the measure called the Dissimilarity Index, it was 86 in 1970 at the block group level. That is extremely high concentration. This segregation, this anti-black sentiment, is a leftover, a holdover. We got to go back to slavery days, okay? White supremacy, you are oppressed, will never be welcome into our society. Therefore, you must be separate because we don't want you going to our churches, our schools, working with us, intermarrying. Okay, people used to go up to Washington to get intermarried, okay? Intermarried. But you have a setup where our study starts in 64 of some neighborhoods being more than 2/3 black, some are 80% black, some blocks were probably 100% black, if the entire police force was white. Here's a quote from James Baldwin. Can everybody see that in the back? Is it large enough? No. Okay, well then I will read it. Policing the ghetto, a bitter country. The only way to this is from 1960. The only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. Their presence is an insult, and it would be, even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to the children. They represent the force of the white world and that world's criminal profit and ease to keep the black man corralled up here in its place. The badge, the gun, and the holster, and the swinging club make vivid what will happen should his rebellion become overt. He moves through Harlem, therefore, like an occupying soldier in a bitterly hostile country, which is precisely what and where he is, and is the reason he walks in 2s and 3s. And back in the 60s, policemen would only go by 2s into Albina, whereas they would go solo into other neighborhoods. So in the 60s, there became a framework. People started identifying with anti-colonial struggles internationally and interpreting their position in the social structure as ghettoized and disempowered. okay? Black urbanites, they interpret their position as that of a colonized community, especially in the face of repression against the freedom struggle. During 60s rebellions in cities, they increasingly identified with international struggles. So here we have a quote from a youth worker in 1967. There were riots in Portland, Irving Park. A quote, "Albina is categorized as a colony, something separate and foreign from the rest of the city. The mayor wouldn't come to that neighborhood." So the theory, sociologist Robert Staples is one of the persons who used this theory to evaluate and analyze criminal justice. Police in black neighborhoods constitute an army of occupation within the domestic or internal colony. And if you get our paper and read it, I urge you to do so. It goes into how this theory never really was accepted within regular academic circles because of its association with what? Black power and militancy. You weren't supposed to go there. It's okay to be civil rights and want to integrate and accommodate into existing institutions. But this theory suggests that the only way to make change is to change institutions and for communities to have control over their own institutions, schools, police, so forth. Space, power, and social control, police were enforcers of this colonial relationship. So often the only time you're seeing whites in your community is in the symbol of police, right? In these days of high levels of segregation. Police are agents to enforce the status quo and protect the property of colonizers who live outside of the community. And key to this is that within black communities and other repressed communities, police are not seen as your friendly neighborhood policemen, but because of the experience of harassment and intimidation, being treated with derogatory names and epithets is a common thing, okay? You are looking for public safety, you're looking for the policeman to give you what is happening in other communities, right, in a predominant community, but you're not necessarily getting public safety. Reverend Boyd was part of the group, co-founder of the Albina Ministerial Alliance in the 1960s, says, "We knew our part of the city had been designated to allow vice activities." And that's what Baldwin was talking about when he said criminal profit. Because a lot of people have to know that along with segregation and disinvestment, okay, and the lack of conventional lending for business, for housing, okay, there's profit to be made from ghettoization, from a dual housing market, okay? So wealth is being extracted from the community. Vice is allowed, gambling, prostitution, drugs, which has a long history in Portland, as people should know, is contained in that community. In this, Reverend Boyd had met with one of the deputy chiefs of police who said, and even Mayor Trump in the 60s said, because vice and crime and prostitution and drugs are confined to your community, we do not need to have any additional police presence. It was not a problem. So the perception in the community is that the police we need public safety, but we're not necessarily getting it. A letter to the mayor from one of the Albina residents. For years, black people in the Albina area have been bullied and victimized by our so-called lawmen. So Albina's designation as the area where crime and vice flourish prevents citizens from being accepted by the whole community. And only revitalization and gentrification, to be sure, have only occurred when finally when the area was transformed for a place for outsiders to invest and reap profits as slumlords, okay, and with high interest loans. People were advised within the real estate community, don't buy to live there, buy only to invest. And it was only when they started doing public safety measures to make it safe for the new people that the area started to revitalize. So this issue of crime, public safety, is all part of the same process that is happening across the country. So residential segregation of the unwanted, unwelcome people. Right now I've just been studying the 40s really in earnest. And this was going on so strongly in the 40s that crime, people, there was police hysteria. The police chief Jenkins, okay, who in the 20s policed Coontown, okay, in Northwest Portland, and who bragged about getting 150 KKK members to join the police force. He was still there in the 40s. And when the population boomed because of the war migration, there was police hysteria, and Dr. Unthank and some of the other leaders in the black community were saying, no, wait a minute. We don't commit crimes anymore, and there was really no evidence for this, okay? But I'm just saying, criminalization goes hand in hand with keeping the community down. Tombstone territory, that's what it was called by the assistant deputy chief. Unwanted space becomes a zone for the unwanted but profitable activities. The Albina neighborhood and everyone in it becomes criminalized, and there's policing for social control rather than safety. So there's a tension between what the community wants, public safety, but a problem because what happens is racial profiling. In the early 60s, there was a demand by people in the community to have some more policing because of all the vice activities, and people couldn't come and go necessarily freely without being harassed and so forth. So there's a police sweep, but the effect of the sweep is just innocent people would be caught up in it. And so the Northwest Defender of Black Paper said, good person should not feel offended or persecuted, but cooperate with officers. Okay, I'm turning it over to my colleague.
Thanks. Thank you. So our paper begins in 1964, and it begins with an incident that happened, the death of Cleotis Rhodes at the hands of Portland police. Cleotis Rhodes was shot in the back. The police said he was trying to escape. But what made the incident something that was interesting and that was that had really galvanized the community was the fact that he had been stopped and pulled over for reckless driving. He was driving erratically, and he was pulled over by the police. And Cleotis Rhodes fled the scene. The police officer followed him back to his home. There was a struggle on their porch. At one point, the police officer's gun fell out of his holster, and Cleotis Rhodes' wife picked it up and handed it back to the officer. The officer then arrested Mr. Rhodes, brought him in a squad car, and took him down to the station. And somehow, on the way to the station, it was said that Mr. Rhodes had tried to escape from the back of the police car, and he ended up being shot in the back. That case went to the grand jury, and the grand jury cleared Officer Freeman of any wrongdoing. However, they found his actions indefensible, and they also wondered why he had not driven Mr. Rhodes to a hospital that was just a few blocks away, but instead he brought him across town as he lay bleeding and dying in the back of the police car. Now this not only galvanized the community, but it also had a big impact on Chief McNamara, who was the incoming police chief at that time, and he was upset by this incident too, and he instituted a policy change which said you could only use deadly force in cases of self-defense or when dealing with an escaping felon, not somebody who was escaping from a misdemeanor. So at this time, the civil rights movement had been going on since there had been segregation and oppression here in Portland and across the nation. But at this time, police brutality really becomes a key issue in the civil rights movement here in Portland. And during that time, the civil rights movement kind of shifted, and as more young people got involved, and as people really began to see their communities as a colony, the demand shifted from integration to actually having self-determination or community control over the institutions within the neighborhood, and it became more of a Black Power movement. So during this time, Melvin Spencer, who was the brother-in-law of Cleotis Rhodes, began to organize around issues of police brutality. He was working for an anti-poverty group at that time called CCAP, And they began to hold forums with different members of the interfaith community on issues of police brutality. And that drew the attention of the Portland police. Prior to this time, the civil rights movement really hadn't attracted the attention of the Portland police very much, but when they started talking about issues of police brutality and harassment, the police began to pay excruciating attention to the movement. In the 1960s, we often don't think of our police department, of their job as kind of monitoring people who are engaging in political dissent. We think of that maybe in East Germany or Egypt or different places. But in the 1960s, really it was a primary duty of the police department to keep track of subversives. That might not have been the reason why people would sign up to become a police officer. They wanted to protect people and have public safety. But in a survey of police officers that was conducted in the mid-1960s, keeping track of subversives was the eighth most important aspect of policing. It came in ahead of helping little old ladies and traffic duties. And that really has its roots here in Portland back in the 1920s, when the police bureau really became active in monitoring dissent here in the city with the Red Squads. And also nationally, the FBI, which we often think of like the arrest of John Dillinger or maybe some of the work that they did against the mafia, but during J. Edgar Hoover's reign, the primary duty of the FBI was to monitor, surveil, disrupt, and destroy political dissidents here in this country. So keeping track and monitoring subversives didn't just mean collecting information or monitoring what was going on with groups that were opposed to the political structure. It was more than that. It was actively disrupting, harassing, and sabotaging, basically trying to destroy these particular groups. And here's a quote by a Portland police lieutenant who worked for the intelligence unit. He described his job as like making bread. You take a little flour, water, yeast, and massage it and come up with a product. The COINTELPRO program was a counterintelligence program, and this wasn't just happening on a local scale, this was also happening on a national scale. And the COINTELPRO program was the counterintelligence program. It was a top secret program within the FBI, and the purpose of that program really was to destroy and disrupt any sort of political dissident, any sort of political movements that were going on in this country. And there's countless examples of what COINTELPRO did. They did things such as try to drive wedges between the East Coast and the West Coast Black Panther Party movements by writing fake letters from the leaders of one chapter to another chapter to try to get them to foster infighting. There's examples of the FBI going to Wounded Knee, to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and framing people for killings that they didn't commit. And there's actually examples of people dying from this program, such as Fred Hampton in Chicago. And an example of what that was like and how that was instituted here in Portland, there was a chapter of the Black Panther Party in Portland, and I think in 1970 they began their breakfast program. So they began serving free breakfast to children at Highland Church, which is near where King School is. And in order to, the Black Panther Party didn't have a big bank account, it didn't have a lot of donors that were giving to it, so they would have to go door to door to try to solicit donations for the breakfast program, to try to get things like eggs and milk and bread and sausage to be able to feed the children. So they would go around to different Albina businesses and try to solicit donations, either in the form of food or in the form of money. When the people that owned a battery shop in Albina had the Black Panthers come in to solicit a donation from them, they called the police. And they complained because when the Black Panthers came in, they said they leaned on our counters and they made people in our business feel uncomfortable. So, a police force that is geared towards public safety might take a complaint like that and dismiss it, saying basically, there's nothing here, you're feeling uncomfortable by people coming in, but it doesn't seem like a crime is going on. However, given the purpose of trying to disrupt and destroy some of these political movements, the police took this very seriously. And they decided to conduct a survey of every single business in the Albina area to see if they could come up with evidence of the Black Panther Party trying to basically shake down businesses and extort money out of them to fund their breakfast program. So people who were working the beat in Albina, the different officers that were working in the beat, were told to go out and go to every single business, go door to door, and find out if the Black Panther Party had indeed come in there and if there was any evidence of them extorting money from the different businesses. So the beat cops went out and did a survey of the area, and they found absolutely no evidence of a Black Panther Party extortion ring. But that's just to give you an idea of how policing really wasn't about public safety, but it was about social control. Throughout this time, from the model cities planning process to throughout the whole spectrum of the civil rights movement that was occurring, from people participating in different public processes to people calling for an independent police force in Albina, there were three main demands that the community was making. They wanted to have an end to police harassment and brutality. They wanted civilian oversight of the police force, and they wanted increased Black representation in law enforcement. And there's kind of a fourth demand that's implied in this too. They also wanted their communities to be safe, just like everybody wants their community to be safe. So they wanted to get rid of the crime and drugs and prostitutions that had plagued their community. They didn't want their community to be tombstone territory. Despite all the different efforts that were going on, rallies, protests, letter writing campaigns, those three demands were not realized during that time. However, when Robert Probasco and 13 other Albina residents filed a class action lawsuit in U.S. District Court against the mayor, the city council, the chief of police, and 38 named officers, that resulted in some changes. That suit, there was not a guilty plea found, but there was basically a consent decree that was written up, and a consent decree implies that there was no wrongdoing on the part of the city. But the city agreed to make these changes despite the fact that they wouldn't admit that they had been doing any wrongdoing. So the changes that they agreed to make in 1971 as a result of that class action lawsuit were to stop the use of racial epithets, to ban the use of sap gloves and leaded batons, to say that all officers had to have a search warrant before they would enter Albina homes, to have their officers take racial sensitivity training, to establish a way for citizens to file complaints against the police, and to institute an affirmative action plan so that they could diversify the police force. In the 1970s, the results of the Probasco decree started becoming instituted. There was also a change in city government and a more progressive regime took over. And the first change that happened was the establishment of the Internal Affairs Bureau within the Portland Police Department. The Internal Affairs was a way for citizens to file complaints against the police force. Prior to the establishment of Internal Affairs and Internal Affairs Department, there was no way for people to complain or to file some sort of complaint against the police. However, Internal Affairs was not civilian oversight. This was a department within the Portland Police Bureau, and it was basically the police policing themselves. And as a result, there were less than 10% of those complaints that were found to be sustained or found to be valid. Affirmative action also took place. There was an affirmative action officer that was hired in the early 1970s. However, he quit after just 1 year in office because he was never invited or allowed to participate in any of the hiring or training meetings that were happening within the Portland Police Bureau. So after that, the Police Bureau actually had a pretty ambitious plan to diversify the police force and set goals to try to hire a more diverse officer corps. However, by 1980, the Portland Police Bureau was still 97% white, and there were only 12 Black officers. Chief Baker was also hired in the early 1970s. He was the first outsider to lead the Bureau. He came from Berkeley, California. And in 1974, this might sound familiar to a lot of people because we just recently completed a Department of Justice investigation here in Portland. That wasn't the first time that the Department of Justice came to Portland. The Department of Justice came at the behest of the Black community in 1974, and they came in to investigate whether or not there was a pattern of civil rights violations after 4 young Black men had been killed by the police in a 6-month period. And what really sparked outrage within the community was that 4th killing. It was a young man named Ricky Charles Johnson. He was just 17 years old, so that's kind of echoes of the Mike Brown shooting that happened in Ferguson. He was shot in the back of the head. And he was shot by Officer Kenneth Sanford, who had been going undercover because Ricky Charles Johnson was at a house where a robbery had taken place. A taxi driver had gone to deliver Chinese food to that particular house, and he was robbed of $10. So he called the police and reported it. When somebody from that house called to order food again from the taxi company, Kenneth Sanford went undercover as a taxi driver. He had his gun and a box of food, and when he went to the door and there was some sort of suspicious activity going on, the young man that answered the door fled the house, and he saw somebody standing in the shadows and said the young man, Ricky Charles Johnson, had pulled a gun on him, and he ended up being shot in the back of the head. The Department of Justice investigated. They found that there was no pattern or practice of civil rights violations going on in Portland. That's a very high standard that the Department of Justice has to find in order to sustain a judgment of having a pattern or practice of civil rights violations, but they were careful to qualify that by saying that they didn't think that any of these shootings were necessarily justified. They thought that there were problems with each of these incidents, but that there wasn't an overall pattern or practice of civil rights violations. And then during this time too, COINTELPRO, that counterintelligence program of the FBI, was exposed nationally. So that kind of shifted policing and really made people question some of these institutions like police and government. The reforms that happened might not have had a big effect on how people within communities were really experiencing policing in Portland, because each of those reforms in and of themselves were not necessarily all that effective. But one of the greatest impacts of each of those reforms was the backlash that they produced. The Portland Police Association is the police officers union here in Portland. We were one of the first cities to actually have a union for our police force. And prior to this time, that union had really achieved a lot of things in terms of improving the working conditions and the working life for police officers who work for the Portland Police Bureau.